Okay.
All right, we'll go ahead and record. All right. Hey, good morning, and welcome to the Keystone Carnivore Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Bachman. And today on the podcast, we have Jason Atkinson, a health coach, nutritionist, formerly full-time anatomy, physiology, and biology teacher, and also the author of Live Like an Athlete. Formerly obese and maintained a weight loss of 55 pounds, Jason has also reversed his symptoms of blood pressure. Jason is also the host of Get Better Naturally podcast. Jason, welcome to the show today.
Hey, Corey, great to be here. Thank you.
So we've been, discussing some really good things about, the low carb community, some of the approaches to low carb. Can you tell us a little bit about your background with the lower carb, higher protein approach?
Sure. Yeah, just in chatting a little bit, prior to the show, what I mentioned to you was that for the most part, I'm against the dogma or the so-called food religions or food cults that have cropped up, especially online. For the most part, I'm opposed to diets that have a name. That's why when I wrote Live Like an Athlete, I didn't make a quote diet book out of it. Diet obviously is one huge factor when it comes to reversing lifestyle, health conditions, and maintaining a healthy weight. But it's only one facet, it's only one piece of the puzzle. For me personally, the journey through the low carb spectrum, if you will, began with me at 254 pounds. I was about 33% body fat. As you mentioned in the intro, I had high blood pressure. And, that was a stark realization. At that moment in time, thankfully, my doctor was forward thinking enough. When I asked, what can I do about it? They presented me with the option. You can take high blood pressure medication, or you could lose some weight. So, well, I take option B because I'm not going to be on medication for the rest of my life. So option B was lose some weight. So I said, how much weight should I lose? They said at least 10%, at least 10% of your body weight. And so I did a little quick math in my head. I said, that's 25 pounds. If I do that, I'll still be weighing 225 pounds. I'm going to double that. I'm going to lose over 50 pounds. So my initial goal was 199. I went from 254 to 199. I drew that little line in the sand and I said, no more. I'm going to be below 200 pounds. So I doubled, what the expectation was. And that was enough to relieve the symptoms of high blood pressure so that I didn't need the medication. The only thing that was lacking in my doctor's approach, something you mentioned earlier about the training that you got while you were obtaining your degree.
Yep.
Doctors, for the most part, are not well versed in nutrition. So when I asked, how should I go about this? How should I lose the weight? They were somewhat dumbfounded. They didn't really have a good suggestion for me. The standard medical advice is just going to be eat less, move more. What we've been hearing for, decades now. And that's not really working that well. If you take a quick glance around or look up some data, you'll see that the majority of the U.S. population now is either overweight or obese. And as a society, we have lots of metabolic problems. It's actually known as metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is going to be one or more of those hot buttons: high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, high cholesterol, triglycerides, wide abdominal circumference. So any two or more of those risk factors, you clump them together and they call it metabolic syndrome. So what the medical community does is they just throw up their hands and they say, we don't know what causes this and we don't know how to fix it. But Corey, I've got a feeling you and I do have an idea of what caused this and we do know how to fix it. So my journey through low carb began with a bodybuilding style diet. That was a portion control type thing. And in hindsight, I can look back and see how what I did over the span of time that I was losing the weight and maintaining that weight loss, I was progressively eliminating carbohydrates from the diet, beginning with the worst offenders, which are flour and sugar. Wheat flour, by the way, elevates blood sugar faster than granulated table sugar. So eliminating those worst offenders from the diet, just controlling the portions, having a portion of protein, a portion of carbohydrates about every 3 hours, standard bodybuilder fitness type diet, which if you're not fat adapted, you do need to eat pretty frequently. But, once you become fat adapted, you see that need or desire to eat every 3 hours is no longer present. So something I recommend to a lot of my clients and listeners is to do the work to become fat adapted. But the progression was eliminating the worst offenders, and then later on going into more of a ketogenic type diet. Or I'm sorry, second progression was a paleo style diet. So eliminating grains from the diet, eliminating legumes, later on progressing into a ketogenic type diet, getting rid of some of the starchy vegetables and some of the high sugar fruit. And then finally experimenting a little bit with a carnivore style diet that is eliminating 100% of all of the plant source foods in the diet. I'm not personally practicing as a strict carnivore diet, but I do see the value in it because it's a high protein, high nutrient type diet. And what happens, as we eliminate more and more of these things that we don't really need, we see that the bullseye, the center of what I refer to as the human diet, actually is a meat-based diet, a high protein diet, higher, in comparison to the standard American diet, and a high nutrient diet. So, things that we've eaten for thousands of years as a species, meat, eggs, dairy, those should be the foundation of the human diet. And once we come to that realization, then, we can thrive as we're intended to as a species and get rid of the things that we simply don't need. The foods that are addictive, if you want to get into some detail about that, you and I talked about a little bit earlier. We'll get into that food marketing and food addiction. But yeah, that was the journey through the whole low carb spectrum, starting with portion control and ending with, an ultimate elimination diet, which is close to a carnivore or 100% carnivore if someone wants to go that route. I think it's fascinating, just as an anthropological study, that we've had civilizations in human history that have thrived without any plant foods in the diet whatsoever, which is in stark contrast to recommendations of our, U.S. dietary guidelines have been for the past 30, 40 years, that somehow the foods that we've thrived on for thousands of years are causing harmful effects, and that we should actually consume primarily grains as the basis of our diet. So how contrary is that to, what historically has been the human diet?
Yeah, well, you definitely hit on some really good points there. I also think, that it is important that we, don't fit everybody, into a box as far as with, names on diets, keto, carnivore, low carb, paleo. Sometimes say, oh, well, I'm keto. Well, if they go have like a little bit of a carb refeed and then, their community says, oh, well, you're not keto anymore. There was a really good quote that I heard from Stan Efferding, certified strength and conditioning specialist.
Yeah, Stan the man.
Yeah, Stan. He had a really good quote. The question was, well, what's the best diet? Well, the one you'll follow. And what are the best exercises? The ones that you'll do. So I definitely think adherence, is something that's very important. Whatever approach that you do take, can you maintain that for a long period of time? Yeah.
That's one of the things that I always emphasize is sustainability. Because if you do something short term to achieve a result, but it's not something that you can sustain long term, you're just going to end up right back where you were before, or even in worse condition. So, obviously I'm approaching this from more of a weight loss perspective, because that was my journey. As I mentioned, I was, at least 55 pounds overweight. The majority of Americans who have metabolic disorders is directly tied to the fact that they are overweight or obese. So, I focus my efforts on that. But what we're talking about is not just weight loss, it's actually fat loss, or, loss of body fat, excess body fat. So it's easy to track it on a scale to say, okay, I weigh this much, now I weigh this much, now I weigh this much. Well, your health may or may not be improving with drops in body weight, because the last thing you want is to sacrifice lean body mass in pursuit of a lower body weight on the scale. So, excuse me, something to think about, the way that carbohydrates in and out of the body influence body weight as well. You mentioned earlier the carnivore people that have a carb refeed or whatever. Okay, so I've done like a cyclical style diet, ketogenic diet, maybe 5 days low carb up on the weekends. And what I've noticed is, the body weight shoots up maybe 5 or 6 pounds over 2 days, because you're retaining so much water, and outside of gaining or losing lean mass or body fat, a lot of excess inflammation and water in the body is not very healthy either. Aside from the effects they can have on the blood sugar and things like that. But every gram of carbohydrate in your body holds 3 grams of water in suspension. So a lot of that's going to be in the muscle tissue, which, for someone who's an endurance athlete, or they're, involved in some training or sports, or the competitive bodybuilder or whatever, that has its advantages, if they're clean carbohydrates. But what happens with these, what I call carbohydrates, we talked about this a little bit earlier, a lot of those come right along with industrial seed oils, the so-called vegetable oils. Well, when you increase insulin, that's a transport hormone that's going to transport lots of nutrients, glycogen, carbohydrate, protein, amino acids. But if you have things like these industrial seed oils, which are highly inflammatory, they really are the source of a lot of the health problems and the heart problems and so forth, are from these man-made artificial fats. That insulin spike is just going to drag those right into storage right along with it. So not only do you have the processed sugar and flour that's going to spike insulin, spike blood sugar, cause the roller coaster and all that, it's going to cause you to store these things that you don't want in your body. So that's why I say stay away from the carbohydrates. You and I talked a little bit just in preparing for today's conversation about the history of how we got in this mess in the first place. What was the thing you posted on Instagram the other day? It was a picture of some type of process. What was that?
So it was a really interesting thing. I had my phone with me, and I wanted to take a picture of what everybody was going after. What foods are people going after during this whole pandemic that we have going on?
Right.
A lot of the things that I saw missing were like a lot of the grain-based, cereals that you see. And in that same aisle, I scrolled over and I found a new brand of Pop-Tarts. Now, I used to do the Fit Your Macros approach for a bodybuilding contest about 5 years ago, and that was one of my base foods, believe it or not. But they came out with a new brand,
I believe it.
Pretzel Pop-Tarts. And obviously you can see in that, you mentioned about the processed seed oils and the refined sugars and flour.
Right.
So that definitely contained that in there.
All right. Well, my comment to that was, these foods should actually be illegal to manufacture and market in the first place. But instead of being illegal, what happens is they get the stamp of approval from this authority and that authority. American Heart Association, that's heart healthy whole grains, and this will help reduce cholesterol. And now we're ascribing all of these great health benefits to something that's just absolute garbage. It's the perfect concoction of sugar, flour, oil. These food manufacturing companies employ food scientists around the clock, and they formulate these products to contain the exact amount of these ingredients to reach what is known as the bliss point. So that's the exact amount that's going to cause an addictive response, because basically that's what they're designed for. They're designed to be addictive. They don't provide anything in terms of nutrition or satiety, so that someone will just, you know the old line with the potato chips, I bet you can't eat just one. Okay, well, that's their game, because you can't eat just one, because when you eat one, the effects that it has on your body is you want another one and another one and another one until you've eaten the whole bag, and then you got to go find another bag, because we're not obtaining any nutrients or fullness or any sense of satiety. So that's the downside of the grain-based diet, the high fructose corn syrup and other ingredients that are in a lot of these food-like products. I call them carbohydrates. That's the term that I came up with. Basically, if it's in a bag or a box or a bottle, you don't really need it. You shouldn't eat it, even in small amounts. The whole calorie lie has been used to promote these type of foods as being okay in moderation, when in actuality, there's really no safe level of consumption of any of these, because, like I said, they're designed to be addictive. They have long-term negative health consequences, and they're designed strictly with profit in mind. It's a sad thing, but the food manufacturing companies could care less about anyone's health. And the products are there to make money for the food manufacturer. Now they'll decorate them, they'll dress them up. It's kind of camouflage. They'll put on a little seal of this, and it's low in this, and it's heart healthy that, and maybe no high fructose corn syrup. Okay, yeah, well, but that's just to take your focus off of what's actually in the product and what it actually does contain and what it will do to you. So they're not looking out for our interests at all. And that whole agenda of the grain-based diet is turned into the most widespread health crisis in the history of the human race. You mentioned briefly pandemic, and I personally want to keep as much pandemic out of the podcast world as I can right now.
Yeah.
Because I think the popular media is over promoting that. But when you talk about terms of a health crisis or a pandemic, hundreds of thousands of people die every year from preventable lifestyle conditions. Preventable so-called diseases, they're not even actually diseases. They're the result of lifestyle. And what we need are more educators like us, people who are in the trenches, who want to, take people's hand and walk them through this and show them, hey, here's what to do and here's what not to do, and be that voice of hope and be that beacon in the dark, if you will. I consulted with a new client just the other day, and she says, hey, I want to try keto. And I said, okay, well, listen, here's the first thing. Don't believe the popular media version of keto that you're going to see and hear about out there, okay? A ketogenic diet is going to, number one, first and foremost, it's going to be low enough in carbohydrates to cause your body to transition over to burning fat for fuel and producing ketones as a byproduct of that to power the brain and body in the absence of glucose. Okay, that's it. The popular version of keto is a high-fat diet. Personally, I promote a higher protein approach. Fat can be kind of moderate. It's not 100% not on the menu. It's on the menu, but it doesn't need to be the priority. I personally feel like the fat that you consume, should just be the fat that's normally in your protein foods. So eggs, for example, the yolks are going to have some fat in it along with the protein. If you get a cut of meat, that's going to have some fat in it. You have, some dairy, that's going to have some fat in it. Cheese is going to have some fat in it. It's okay. You can justify consuming some of that fat as long as there's more protein that comes along with it, in contrast to popular ketogenic diet, which, actually these ratios were formulated for epilepsy patients, super high fat intake and moderate protein. Don't eat too much protein because that's going to knock you out of ketosis, which is not factual. But the idea of exchanging your carbohydrates for fat is really doomed to fail. Are you familiar with Dr. Ted Naiman, Burn Fat, Not Sugar, author of the PE diet, or the protein to energy ratio diet?
Yeah, absolutely. I do follow him on Instagram.
Okay.
And seen a lot of
Absolutely
his good
brilliant.
stuff.
Yes, absolutely brilliant. He has my highest respect, and I've done a ton of research into his material and listened to every podcast he's been on and some of his lectures that he's done. The idea of the protein to energy ratio, it works perfectly in the real world. The thing is, protein's over here on this side of the scale, and fat and carbs are both over here on this side of the scale. They're both energy. So when people are exchanging carbohydrates for fat, they're bumping their fat up, they're bumping their carbs down. You're just exchanging one form of energy for another. The real key to solving that long-term health problem, and correcting your diet, is to increase the amount of protein in the diet. And that's something I mentioned, 2 years ago, before I'd ever heard of Ted Naiman. In my book, Live Like an Athlete, I mentioned a higher protein diet because the American diet is too high in carbohydrates. It's too low in protein and nutrients. That's why we got to get the balance corrected. We got to get the protein up and get the energy down, not the other way around. So when you focus your diet on more protein, and all of this, Ted Naiman didn't invent any of this either. But there were two Australian researchers named Raubenheimer and Simpson. So they did all this meta-analysis of all the data. The idea behind the protein energy concept, it's actually called nutritional geometry. So it's a tool that's been used to study the diet. Any species on the planet will prioritize protein over non-protein energy, but we'll also consume more non-protein energy in an effort to obtain sufficient protein. So what happened, in the 1960s and 70s that really threw the American diet out of whack, and this was actually due to government guidelines, like we said earlier, the grain-based diet. What actually happened was we diluted all the protein in the diet and replaced it with primarily carbohydrates, but some fat as well in the form of industrial seed oils. So that energy went way up. Well, we're still going to eat sufficient amount of protein, but how much non-energy protein has to come along with that? If you're eating a super high fat protein, you're going to have to consume more fat in order to get sufficient protein. If you're mixing your protein in with a carbohydrate source, you're going to have to eat more carbohydrate in order to get sufficient protein, but we're always going to get sufficient protein. So, the real key to making that whole system work is to prioritize the protein in the diet, because that's going to cause you to feel fuller with less. It has a huge metabolic reward because it increases thermogenesis. So, about 30% of the calories from protein are just going to be used up to process and store those nutrients in the first place. Plus, you've got the added advantage of increasing lean body mass, which that's your, calorie burning engine around the clock. That's what's going to help you to burn more energy throughout the day, even at rest. So that's a triple win. Again, those are things I talked about in my book. Which, I don't. If you wanted to get into the 3 keys, we can talk about that one too. Didn't you have it? You had a question written down, I think. I don't know how we phrased it.
Yeah, I did. And I think you mentioned this in your book, your 3 keys to simplifying nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's real simple. So I'll go through it one time, and then I'll just explain what each of the 3 points are.
Yep.
Lean it up, clean it up, and green it up. So Lean It Up is for protein. As we mentioned earlier, protein is the major metabolic driver in the body. It's involved in every physiological process and cell turnover. It has a high thermic effect, so increased calorie burning, provides a feeling of fullness so that we're not craving other things. The word protein actually means, it comes from a Greek term which means of primary importance. So that's the number one and most important nutrient that we need, period. Clean It Up just stands for getting rid of the processed grains, industrial seed oils, all the so-called carbohydrates in the diet, the flour, sugar, and all that stuff that we just shouldn't even be eating in the first place. Now, I'm not saying you have to 100% eliminate all of that, but at least minimize it as much as possible. And then the third key is to green it up, which is for vegetables. Of course, we've got a carnivore audience here, so I'm not saying that vegetables are 100% necessary. Personally, I don't feel the need to eliminate 100% plant foods from my diet, but people can do that if they choose. And, that can be healthy. That can be a healthy diet with or without plants. So the value of having the vegetables in the diet is the higher fiber, the higher volume that they take up in the stomach, and of course they're going to provide some micronutrients in the form of vitamins and minerals, things like that we need. So those are the three keys: lean it up, clean it up, green it up. So it's easy to remember, doesn't require tracking macros. It doesn't require having some little app on your phone that you put everything that goes into your mouth into a database. It doesn't require any of that. You can just stop and think to yourself, is this lean, clean, and green? Okay, if it is, you're good to go. And as far as the amounts, your size of your stomach and your ability to actually hold the food is going to basically limit how much of it you can consume if you're eating the right type of things. So if your diet is focused on the processed so-called food products, you can actually override your impulse to stop eating it because they're so highly addictive that you'll just continue to eat past the point of fullness. When you're focusing your diet on, the high animal source protein, the real nutrients that we really need, things that are lean, clean, and green, you're going to stop eating when you get full because you've had enough. Now, Corey, have you ever experimented with intermittent fasting?
Absolutely. I'm actually doing it as we speak right now. So just
Okay.
about a cup of coffee. I don't have any near me right now. But
Right.
sometimes I'll do like a 16-8 ratio, 16 hours fasted, 8 hours. I've noticed since I've been doing that over the last couple of years, that's definitely helped with body composition. So I'm definitely in favor of that. And
Yeah.
I did like some of the points that you hit on with not completely, getting rid of those plant-based foods too, as long as you're prioritizing protein. One of the things that I've, reposted over the last couple of years on social media is, various types of carnivore. And I think, they do fall in line, with that higher protein approach as well. So, just doing, encouraging people to doing what works better for them.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
The reason why I brought the intermittent fasting up is what I've noticed. I do it occasionally. I'm not currently doing it this month. This month I'm really focused on high protein, low carb. I'm running a little challenge on my website or through my social media channels. Anybody can join in for free if they want to do that. The idea is to high protein, low carb. But the reason why I brought up the intermittent fasting is I've noticed that, I can fast 20 to 22 hours a day, eat a pound of red meat, and an hour or two later, it's like I can't. That's like all the food I can eat. It's like, for the entire day, all I had was a pound of meat. Whereas, if you're eating every 2 or 3 hours, it seems like at night especially, that's when the cravings for the carbohydrates and things like that are most likely to surface. Even if you've had thousands of calories of food throughout the day, you can still find a way to fit in more of those refined and processed type foods. Or if you focused on, like I said, the high protein, like red meat, just eating I make 4 hamburgers out of a pound of meat, cheeseburgers, throw a little cheese on it. Okay, there's a little fat in there. after not having eaten anything for 20 to 22 hours. And then an hour or two later, it's all I can do to get like a whey protein shake and a couple of Quest bars down. You know, it's just like incredible the impact that it has on the satiety receptors in the stomach and the brain that's telling your body, hey, you've obtained sufficient nutrients. That's all you need.
Definitely. With intermittent fasting, have you also noticed any cognitive benefits with that too?
I would have to say yes, that I did. I've actually done some experiments with intermittent fasting where, as I mentioned earlier, I've done 20 hours a day. I've done 22 hours a day of consecutive days of intermittent fasting up to an entire month. So 2 separate months, I did, this protocol. And yeah, it's the way human physiology works. Our body is really designed to run mostly on stored body fat, especially during the day. You think about a hunter-gatherer type society. You're going to be out hunting during the day, procuring food. And then in the evening, it's time to take it back to camp, cook it, eat it, whatever it ends up being. Evening is time to switch over to the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest nervous system. Go ahead and have a good meal. That's going to get you in the right kind of neurology to have good sound quality of sleep. So when the biohackers figured all this stuff out, they started fasting not for body composition benefits, but for cognitive improvement. Because when your brain is running on ketones, that's like rocket fuel for your brain, right? So it's carbohydrates and eating in general, insulin spikes, all that stuff's going to kind of slow you down, make you a little more sluggish, not thinking as clearly. So yes, I've definitely noticed cognitive improvement from intermittent fasting for certain.
Excellent. Yeah, same here. Usually able to get most of my work done, from early morning, mid-afternoon, not having that, 2 p.m., 3 p.m., crash in energy. So definitely able to keep energy up throughout the day. One of the other things we mentioned, prior to getting on here this morning was you mentioned another book. It was called Fed Up.
Fed Up is a health documentary.
Okay.
Fed Up really opened the door for all these health documentaries. This one was out maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I know Dr. Mark Hyman was one of the people who was really prominently featured in that film. A lot of people would be familiar with him. But Fed Up is all about how fat really became the scapegoat for the harm that sugar and flour were doing in the diet. So, the whole low fat is healthy trend, the whole idea that, high carbohydrate diet that came out in the 80s in response to, dietary guidelines for Americans stating that the grain-based diet was the healthiest thing ever, and that we should really avoid saturated fat, especially from things like egg yolks and cheese and meat. The whole thing is absurd. The history of it goes back much further than that. Of course, you're familiar with the 7-country study in Ansel Keys, the shoddy science that was used to promote the low-fat diet in response to the American health scare that, everyone suddenly had heart disease, and we didn't know where this heart disease was coming from. So the culprit that was picked was high fat in the diet, and so everyone in America was told, eat low fat, eat as lowest amounts of fat as possible. And what did we do instead of the fat? We just replaced it with carbohydrates, which that whole thing blew up big time and caused the largest metabolic, health crisis that has ever happened in the human history. So, the flip side of that is, though, and we have to be careful to not substitute that high fat diet, the whole popular online keto kind of thing I was talking about earlier, the idea that, you can just eat as much fat as you want as long as you don't eat carbohydrate. that's almost as absurd as the idea that, oh, you can eat as much carbohydrate as you want as long as you don't eat fat. It's at the end of the day, it is a certain amount of energy in the body and a certain amount of energy out of the body. Calories are the guideline that we've used the metric that we've used to measure the amount, which is not 100% accurate. If you know about the calorimeter, that was invented in the 1800s. Basically, we're going to burn a small amount of a type of food and see how much energy is released from it. There's no real correlation between what happens in a calorimeter and what happens in the human body, because there's hormones that are involved that regulate the amount of energy that we use, and the partitioning of different nutrients is different, and the thermic effect that I mentioned earlier is different, in different macronutrients. So we've come a long way since the 1800s, but the bottom line is there's no diet that's going to allow you to just eat as much of anything that you want without taking into consideration the amount of energy that it contains. And we know that. But high protein, low carb is as close to a sure thing as you can get, because of the effects that it has on blood sugar regulation, which drives appetite, leptin levels, ghrelin levels, all those things that are happening below the surface. Any hormone, thyroid hormones, testosterone, estrogen, blood sugar, all these things are going on. Insulin, those are all hormones. And all of that is what's working together to determine what happens to these foods once they enter the body.
Definitely. And one of the things I mentioned too a couple of weeks ago, I think it was in the beginning of March, is I went to a conference at one of the local hospitals here, and believe it or not, they allowed one of our local orthopedic surgeons, just like Dr. Sean Baker, as he's a orthopedic surgeon, author of the Carnivore Diet. We had an orthopedic surgeon come up to a podium in an auditorium, and he talked about the benefits of a higher protein, lower carbohydrate. He discussed a little bit about keto and carnivore, but this was really surprising to hear a doctor at a hospital talking about these things. And there were some controversial hands raised, and doctors that got their PhD back in the 1960s and 70s that were a little bit angry that this new approach, which is not really that new, this is stuff that was, evident for how many years, we discussed already.
Right.
So,
Well, fortunately, public opinion is shifting, and like I said, we've come a long way. So
definitely.
Are we? Did you have any further questions?
I did.
I'm gonna need to start wrapping it up here.
Yeah. One last question.
Sure.
If you had any advice for anybody looking to, improve anything with any of those metabolic conditions that we discussed, with cholesterol, high blood pressure, and if they're considering, a more animal-based, higher protein approach, what would be the best advice that you would give them?
I would say that diet is one tool. It's one piece of the puzzle, but you have to look at it in terms of an overall lifestyle that centers around being the best version of yourself that you can actually be. And that really starts with the mindset. That's why I chose the title Live Like an Athlete for my book. Athletes don't just wing it. They have a game plan. Everything they do is structured and organized around showing up on competition day, being dialed in, being 100% for whatever sport it is. Now, when I say live like an athlete, I'm not saying that 100% of the population is just going to suddenly become a top level athlete. But what I'm saying is borrow the ideas that athletes use to perform at the highest levels. That's why we admire people who have achieved, in sport or competition, because they're goal driven, they're team oriented, they're organized, they're structured. Every bite of food that goes into their mouth is determined ahead of time. Is this going to help or hinder my performance? As far as the nutritional takeaway, if I just had one little piece of advice, I would just say, get the protein up, because that's going to crowd out everything else that doesn't really belong in the diet. And a lean protein, moderate fat, lower carbohydrate, the exact ratio that's been studied and documented to produce the lowest ad libitum energy intake. So if people went to a buffet and they were allowed to eat whatever they wanted, the ratio that produces the lowest voluntary food intake is 50% protein, 40% fat, 10% carbohydrate. Now, I'm not saying everybody has to do 50, 40, 10. That's up to the individual. And like I said earlier, you shouldn't have to have a scientific calculator or an app to tell you how to eat. But if you just focus on prioritizing the nutrients in the diet, it's going to crowd out that stuff that you don't really need. And then, just think of it in terms of this isn't real food. I mean, if you're looking at like a bag of Doritos or cereal or granola bars or pretzel Pop-Tarts or whatever it might be, this is disguised as food. This isn't a real food. This is a food product. I always say real food doesn't need labels. Products need labels to tell you what's in it because it's made up of so many things. If we just stick as close to natural as we can, just, that's why I really chose the name Get Better Naturally. The idea is, things that naturally exist. I mean, we can improve our health without drugs and surgery. Those are the main tools that the medical establishment uses. But really, we should be able to change our behaviors, change the things that we're doing, the way we train, the way we work out, the quality of sleep we're getting, the type of diet that we choose, whatever those factors are, and take charge of our own health and be proactive about it. Don't wait for some authority to come along and tell you do this and don't do that, because the authorities have already spoken and the advice is mostly, not a very high quality mainstream advice. So you have to be willing to really search for the answers and become your own test subject, become your own chemistry lab, if you will, and see what works best for you. Arrive at what's appropriate for you and what works for you. If something works, don't let somebody come on and tell you, oh, you should do this and don't do that. Something's working for you, keep doing it. Like you said earlier, the quote from Stan Efferding, the best diet, the one you'll do. The best training, the one you'll do. Whatever's consistently going to work for you. I'll give you an example, and I don't have any sponsorship or anything from Quest Nutrition, but I love Quest bars, and I've told people, hey, I'm on the Carnivore Quest diet. That's 80% carnivore, 20% Quest bars, okay? Well, Quest bars are a great substitution for sweets, candy bar. They taste like candy and cookies and everything else, but they're low carb, they're high protein. They have, yes, some grains in it, in the form of corn fiber, whatever. It's indigestible. So when I was doing paleo, I never would have eaten a Quest bar because it's got corn fiber. It's a grain, and you can't dare eat a grain, right? When I was doing keto, I wouldn't have eaten it because it's got too much protein and it'll knock you out of ketosis, But just following a high protein, low carbohydrate diet, they're ideal. They've got 4 grams of carbs net. They got 20 something grams of protein. And, the fat's like maybe 7 or 9 grams, something like that. So it's ideal for a 2-to-1 protein to energy ratio. You got double the protein as any other macronutrient. When you add your fat and carbohydrate together, protein is double that amount. It's an ideal ratio. So, don't always judge things, I guess, as being not keto enough or too, that's the danger of the food cults and the food religions we talked about earlier, is adhering to an external code, if you will, and not relying on your own feedback to determine what's the best course of action for you. So that's why I live like an athlete, non-dogmatic, give some broad guidelines of things that people can do to improve the diet, but not giving you a quote unquote diet book. I really went out of my way not to write a diet book. There is some things in there about diet because it's important, but they're general guidelines. They're not strict, you must do this and you must not do that.
Awesome. Well, Jason, I think you really hit on some really great points, some new stuff that, our audience, may learn from today's discussion. Real quick, where can people find you if they're looking for more information about you?
Okay. Best places online to find me are going to go straight to amazon.com/author/Jason Atkinson, or you can just go to amazon.com and look up Live Like an Athlete, grab a copy of the book there in print or Kindle edition. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook at Get Better Naturally. That's probably the best place. You can look for the Get Better Naturally podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podbean, anywhere podcasts are found. I'm in the 5th year of the Get Better Naturally podcast. Or you can also go to my link tree, which has everything, the blog, YouTube, Twitter, everywhere else that I could possibly be located online, and that is linktr.ee/Get Better Naturally.
Okay. Awesome, Jason. Well, I'm sure we'll be in touch, over the course of next few weeks too, and also on social media all the time. Just wanted to say thanks again. And if anyone has any questions, please look up Jason. He's got a lot of great information on his website and his social media pages. So Jason, once again, big thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks a lot, Corey, and much success to you. I know this thing's really going to take off for you, and I just appreciate being able to be here and speak with you today and all your audience.
All right, much appreciated. Thank you.